Welcome back to the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. I'm Salpi Ghazarian. I'm the director of the Institute. And this is an institute that focuses on contemporary Armenian studies. And contemporary Armenian studies, meaning the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, was full of earth-shaking events for the earth, but also for the Armenian nation, because not just of its diasporic nature, but also because of things that happened in the Soviet Union. So each of the global events, and in addition to a few non-global events, each of those make up the collective Armenian national experience. And that's what we do at the Institute. I want to introduce Dr. Shushan Karapetian, who's deputy director of the Institute, Gegham Mughnetsyan, who's the Chechen archivist here at the Institute, and Sarkis Tricha, who is in England at the University of Kent, but was one of our student workers and also a research assistant with Dr. Karapetian on a very specific sort of oral history project. So we will talk about each of the projects in the context of the general work of the Institute. And let me just briefly, for the record, say that when we do talk about contemporary Armenian studies, we start with the early 20th century and the genocide, and recording and documenting that, and beginning with that, continuing to document a whole series of events, movements, occurrences, realities that not just need to be documented, but for which primary sources need to be created. And so starting with the genocide and doing oral histories having to do with the genocide and the immediate post-genocide period, continuing with the Sovietization of Armenia and the 30s and 40s and the difficult Soviet years, continuing with World War II and what that brought both for the world, all of the Armenians who participated, including American Armenians who were involved, French Armenians who were involved, and of course the Armenians from the Soviet space who retreated with the German army and then became the displaced persons that the Americans welcomed. After that, there is the whole post-Stalin and post-Soviet Union repatriation period, Armenians who were called in from all over the world. I'm trying not to cough. From all, and it's not COVID, I got tested. It's just this old cough. Remember those? This is one of those. Who were called in by Stalin to repopulate the Soviet Union. All of those stories, the foment in the Middle East in the 50s and 60s, the Armenians of the Middle East who began to emigrate. That is a whole period of history, even immediately before the Lebanese Civil War, hundreds of thousands of Armenians in Lebanon impacted by that event, the Iranian Revolution impacted by that event, and of course the collapse of the Soviet Union certainly impacted by that event. And then the formulation of the Independent Republic of Armenia and all of the stories and documentation necessary for that period. I missed the earthquake in between. I don't intend to miss the earthquake. That is its own series of stories and memories. After the formulation of the independence of Armenia, then diaspora studies takes on a whole different tack, because now we have, certainly in the United States and most certainly in Los Angeles, but all over the world, pockets of each of these communities that I just got through mentioning, pockets of each of these waves of migration. That's what we do, contemporary Armenian studies. And one of the ways in which we study and document is through oral history. Dr. Karapetian and Gegham Mughnetsyan and Sarkis are engaged in two very specific projects, and they will each tell us about them. Gegham Mughnetsyan is a graduate of American University in DC with a degree in international and public affairs. Dr. Karapetian's PhD is in Armenian studies, and Sarkis Tricha was a cognitive science major here, undergrad, and is now studying creative writing at the University of Kent, a natural consequence of his bachelor's, I would say. So let's start. I think let's start with Gegham and to talk about the Displaced Persons Project, which she manages for the Institute. And then Dr. Karapetian and Sarkis will talk about their niche of the digital diaspora world.
Salpi mentioned displaced persons project that I started working on in February of 2018 encompasses the stories of specific group of people who later, as a process of displacement, turned into a distinct community of their own, who became known as displaced persons, which is a legal term, displaced person, given to the refugees who were in the course of World War II displaced from their place of habitation, mostly to what was the Third Reich. And then after the war, were left in these other places, first unwanted by the local governments, nor able to return to their former place of habitation due to various reasons. For the purpose of discussing the Armenians in this case, whom we worked with, these were people who initially had been displaced from either the former Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire's borderland with the Ottoman Empire to the Armenian genocide, and had ended up in the First Republic of Armenia, which was briefly independent, and then after, when the Red Army took over, they either moved to Crimea or to the regions of Ukraine that are presently again at war, meaning Donetsk, Kharkiv, or as known to them, Kharkiv, and to Kiev. These are Armenians who lived there with their families for the pre-war period up until the 1930s to 1940s. And during the war, when the German armies occupied these territories, they, along with others, Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, were also displaced to Germany through various routes. Some forcefully taken to labor camps, others retreating with the German army, fearing that the advancing Red Army would persecute them as traitors. So then thinking that it would be better to escape, but then ended up in the same fate in Germany again, as being used as forced labor while they were there. After the war, they were no longer wanted by the new German authorities, nor could go back to the Soviet Union. And after 1948, so that in that period between 1945 and up until 1952, most of them lived in a place called a displaced persons camp. These were camps designated all over Germany for specific nationalities. So Ukrainians lived with Ukrainians, Poles lived with Poles, Jews lived with Jews, and then so Armenians ended up in this one camp because there wasn't that many of them. For comparison, there were maybe 500,000 Ukrainian DPs. There were only 4,000 Armenian DPs. So they ended up in the outskirts of Stuttgart in former army barracks, as it was converted into a makeshift refugee camp, and then they lived there for 5-6 years. Some of these people knew each other from the Soviet Union, but the vast number of them didn't. Some lived in Crimea, some lived in Ukraine. At the time, Crimea wasn't part of Ukraine, it was part of the Russian Federation. So, but because of these 5-6 years of living in a camp, they became their own very close community. So up until 1948, when the United States welcomed EP refugees to the United States, they also got the opportunity to move to the United States. And in the United States, ended up finding each other. Eventually, the vast majority of them regrouped in Montebello, which is in East Los Angeles. And they live in the community, have lived. It's one of the oldest and strongest Armenian gathering places in Los Angeles. Having the first Armenian school, one of the first Armenian schools in diaspora in the United States, the first Armenian genocide monument on public land in the United States. Up until the past few years, they had the largest cathedral outside of Armenia, Holy Cross. So this is a very, very strongly rooted community mostly who has ended up here from the camp. So but nothing has been done. No work has been done on this. A lot of work has been done on displaced persons, mainly focusing on the Jewish displaced persons and Poles, Ukrainians too, who are predominantly in the United States in the Chicago area and Detroit area. So a lot has been done on them. So Armenians have been lost in the cracks of this history because they are either classified as Ukrainians because they were from Ukraine, or people are surprised that there would even be Armenians, right, as a displaced person. As their elders of the community started passing away, and the story started going with them, the relatively younger displaced persons who are still with us and their later descendants were very eager to preserve and document and collect this story as primary sources so that later on researchers could make sense of this story and do research on it. So that's where we stepped in. We were also very passionate about this story, and since February of 2018, we started interviewing some of them. But the project is ongoing because we're still hoping to do some more. Presently, we have 35 interviews in the collection, 34 that we have recorded. One was a cassette tape of an earlier recording of the person whom we met, but he no longer could speak because of a stroke, but then we were able to digitize his interviews. So 35 interviews so far of the community. We're hoping to do some more, but fascinating story.
And even though this whole day is titled Stewards of Trauma, you will see, I think, that as all of our panelists talk about their projects as difficult, grueling, tortuous as the experiences were at some points, you'll find they'll be smiling. And just for the record, just to make a point about the intensity of the bonds that were created in these camps, very recently, someone who married into the DP community, every time I see him says, I don't understand. We go on vacation, my wife and I, maybe our kids, they go on vacation, 22 of them all together. And this is what they've always done. And this is completely accurate. This is not an exaggeration. Those bonds, and one has to question and wonder and really begin to study a period that would appear to be a very difficult, not just historic period, but personal period, and the consequences and the outcomes today. Dr. Karapetian and Sarkis, what are you up to?
Okay, I'll start and then Salkis can take over from when he joined. So just as a little background, I was doing a doctoral dissertation at UCLA on Armenian as a heritage language. So I was really coming from a sociolinguistic perspective, and I was interviewing young heritage speakers about language attitudes, language ideologies. I was also doing a linguistic analysis of what their Armenian looks like. If they were born in Armenia, raised here in an Armenian speaking family, what does that look like? Because in heritage studies, we say, well, they know Armenian, but they're dominant in English, but no one knows what that Armenian or that Armglish looks like. So that's where I was. When I was working on the chapter on language attitudes, language ideologies, and language use patterns, I started noticing kind of very interesting trends, particularly with young men and Armenian, that there was this very strong and intense link between kind of language and masculinity, or performing masculinity, or demonstrating, showcasing macho-ness. And this always stuck with me, but I didn't have the chance to really dig deeper for the dissertation. So it was just filed away. And then I was teaching here at USC, still thinking about this, observing all of these oral history projects. Susanna mentioned our Understanding Independence project, which really looks at kind of different layers of experiencing independence. And then Sarkis was taking a class with me, and I remember he sent me an email saying, hey, I'd like to work on anything, really. I think you said, like, anything you've got, I'm happy to work on. And I said, well, let's meet and let me tell you about all kinds of institute projects and projects which haven't even been kind of formulated in my mind, and you tell me what's interesting and so on. And I kind of brought up this idea, and as I was telling him, it was the first time I actually articulated it. I had to articulate it for someone because at this point it was just chaos in my head. And I don't know how we decided that, you know, this was interesting, let's pursue this. So what we ended up doing, and I'll just give a macro level and then Sarkis can add details, is find men who experienced the Soviet collapse in Armenia, who experienced the energy crisis, what we know kind of in inside circles as the dark years, Mughnetsyan. So it's really, truly in parallel to Gegham's project, a project about multiple displacements. So the displacement from Soviet to independence, the displacement from a complete modern society to rapid demodernization and the chaos of the dark years. And then add to that another layer of displacement of coming to the US, particularly to LA, and going from this very Soviet Armenian culture, macho culture that is very much under the influence of this thieves-in-law, a glorification of the thieves-in-law culture, to the urban LA gang subculture or young boy subculture. So that's kind of macro level where we are. So Sarkis, you can fill in the details.
Yeah, so I joined in June 2021. Since I know there are students there, I'll mention that like I knew nothing about masculinity research, nothing about Soviet Armenia, nothing even about Eastern Armenian. And so all of these ideas were brand new. Basically what we did in terms of methodology is we spent some time doing a lit review, and we found like a lot of these oral history projects that there's very little written about this phenomenon. So this is like new ground to break, and we started collecting data a few months later, right there in the office in the studio in the back. We would interview these men, and initially we were really focused on linguistic patterns. So we're thinking about how Armenian is used specifically to display the kind of macho-ness that we're talking about, and how Armenian sort of culturally and linguistically provides this system for creating the macho-ness and expressing, or masculinity and expressing it. So we were looking at how that sort of structure in late Soviet Armenia, early, independent Armenia gets transferred over here to LA, and how it has to change, and how all the new pressures of things like immigration and socioeconomic status now have to play a part in how these men construct basically their identities. So.
Yeah, and can I just add one?
Please, you need to add a couple of things.
A couple of things, because we tend to speak to ourselves and take a lot for granted. So the particular phenomenon that was very interesting for us was this phenomenon of conflict negotiation. So in the Soviet period and post-Soviet period, there was this unwritten understanding that most institutions don't function properly. Many of them have kind of symbolic value or performative value, but not really functional value. So for example, if two neighbors or two peers have a conflict, you don't call the authorities. You call a friend, a buddy, an older cousin, an uncle, and you talk it out. And then if it's not resolved, then there's a higher authority, but it is like a parallel subculture institution outside of the authorities. And this whole talking it out, this conflict negotiation repertoire or skill set, obviously in Armenia, took place in a very specific register of Armenian, of colloquial Armenian. That entire culture is then imported into the LA scene. And what was interesting for me from a sociolinguistic perspective was, even though English is the dominant language, and even though all heritage language research indicates that English will take over most domains, this is a particular domain that was very resilient in terms of not only maintaining Armenian as a functional language, but as the prestige language. So when you have conflict negotiations, and these are men who came in their young adolescence, right? Anywhere from age 4 to 14, 15, 16. Many of them have transitioned to English dominance.
How old are they now?
They're in their 40s, late 30s, early 40s. And yet still this domain of conflict negotiation, of many things related to their identity as men, is performed through and via Armenian. So that was kind of very, very interesting for me. I think that's important to indicate here.
Tell us a little more about the cohort, the interviewees, informants, narrators.
Yeah. So these are men who are from Armenia, who were children or young adolescents during this energy crisis, who had to experience watching their lives, especially their parents' lives fall apart. Because for them, it was often interesting, right? There was no light, there was no hot water. Everyone was huddled around kind of one makeshift fire pit. At home, they got to skip school, they got to play card games, all of this. But at the same time, particularly because they were boys, there was this extra pressure for them to grow up and to man up. So, you know, they had to go wait in line for bread, right? And the instruction was, you better come back with some, even though it's rationed, and there's a chance that you won't be able to if you just patiently kind of dutifully wait in line. So you have to figure out how to be resourceful. This is very important. How to be resourceful in a situation of lacking resources and non-standard, non-typical environments, right? Or I don't know, carry buckets of water on ice, or not have cars or public transportation to get to school and figure that out. So these are men who've experienced kind of the chaos of the energy crisis, and then often, obviously, not against their will, but not with their permission, they end up in a very new environment with a worldview that doesn't match what's happening here, right? With a worldview that these parallel institutions are the real functioning ones, that what it means to be a man is quite different there than it is here. And these are men from all walks of life. That's also very important to mention. I think we went into the project thinking we're targeting a very, very specific profile within this very specific cohort, but really ended up noticing that this subculture permeates all layers of society, whether you are kind of hardcore macho, let's put it that way, or peripherally subscribe to this subculture. I don't know, Sarkis, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, it's all walks of life, even socioeconomically in Armenia, even in terms of education level, even in terms of sort of like political, social status there. And that was something we didn't know going into it. So the cohort actually expanded in that sense.
So let me add a couple of bits of context before I ask both of you, all three of you, to talk about children, the memories of children. First of all, what the word they have not used so far is incarcerated. Many of those in this cohort were formerly incarcerated. So we're talking about serious levels of ignoring the formal authority structures and kind of solving problems on your own. As we talk about the energy crisis, in some ways, it's going to be much easier to talk about the energy crisis and the consequential change of lifestyle in Armenia in the early 90s, because everything I hear today about Ukraine prepping for this winter is exactly the same thing: purchasing generators, thinking about moving to the warmest corner of the house and sealing off the other rooms. And as Shushan said, and that we don't say often enough, this is a society that goes to the opera on Sundays. So we're going from a certain sort of modern lifestyle to a modern lifestyle that suddenly has lost all of the energy resources that make that possible. That's because there was a war with neighboring Azerbaijan, and because with the fall of the Soviet Union, the supply chains that Moscow guaranteed were broken. As a result, energy per country, no energy resources, and all of the consequential things, including things that like people of this generation today will often say, don't light any candles. I don't think it's romantic. I don't think it's cute. We grew up on those candles. I don't want them. So those are bits of context that perhaps will make this useful. Now, all three of you, I keep saying both. Let me just say both projects. And Sarkis, I'm not ignoring you, I promise. No. In all of these cases, unfortunately, I suppose, we get to the cohort of years after the events about which we're talking. And so in both cases, in both project cases, you're dealing with the memories of children. Is that a problem? Is that a pleasure? Is that par for the course, and what's wrong with that? What are the consequences of that? And if you want to take that to trauma, do, but you don't have to. Gegham, you start.
I think it almost can't be mentioned without the trauma, especially when you're talking about the children's. Because I just felt it. Shushan were just talking about these things, and then I almost relived all of those. I've gone through that period myself. I carried water and stood in line for flowers. So it just hit me all of a sudden, and I experienced it. But
Stood in line for flour, not even bread.
yeah, we didn't have bread. They would bring flour and then pass out at schools to children. So flour, vegetable oil, and buckwheat. Yeah. So yeah. Because that'll outlive us, right? Buckwheat.
Yes.
Yeah, because even the mice don't touch it, right? So it'll store well in the winter. So yeah, but in my case, it's very detached because I was interviewing people who were in their 80s and who I mentioned during my presentation at last week at the Oral History Association. Average age of my interviewees at the start of the war in 1941. But we mentioned it as the start of the war, people of the former Soviet Union, because for them the war started in 1941, right? The war had started already in 1939. But in 1941, the average age of the people I interviewed was 9. So these were all children. I think the oldest was maybe 14, 15 during the war, right? So then, and then others were 3 years old, 4 years old, some of them born during the war, some of them born during the, in the DP camps and after the war. So these were all children and who are recounting their memories 7 decades, 8 decades sometimes, if they had memories of Kharkiv or Kiev, that even more after the events. And most of them memories very seldomly shared previously. These were memories that were not shared, so most of them with their own children. They among themselves know it. So the 80-year-olds that I interviewed, as Salpi mentioned too, this is a very tight community. If you've been to Montebello, the Hay Street in Montebello used to be known as the High Street because all Armenians live. Yeah, so yeah, these are people who were in the same bunk at the camp and are now neighbors, right? So they know each other's stories. As it goes down the generations, it's less and less because of language constraints, because a lot of people don't want to share their stories. So I would be sitting there being and then Lilith would be there. Like 2 of us would be there being the first recipients of these stories, right? And then try to keep our composure in the middle and then try to, and sometimes see these people unravel as they're telling the stories. And in a very childlike language, because it's memories of childhood, right? Parents loom larger than life in this story. It's my dad holding my hand, my mom holding my hand. the war starts with their fathers leaving. So, right, the war is synonymous with their fathers leaving. And in general, even the language is like that, right? They notice things that children would notice. One of them is given a bicycle by his German captors, and he talks about the new tires of the bicycle with the same enthusiasm as he talks about clearing of Kharkiv, right? It's the bicycle, right? And then he could take and ride it. Yeah, the food they noticed, the bombardment they noticed, running to the bunker they noticed, and the buildings they noticed are in their description humongous, right? We lived in a large house, but then you know it's the children's memories. Yeah, I mentioned too when I went back to Armenia after a 14, 15-year-old gap. I was shocked because my elementary school was tiny, but then in my mind it was humongous. There was like this statue in front of it that I stood next to it. It was my height. I was like, was this always? Yeah, I'm like standing and I'm like, was this always this? You know, but yeah. So then it comes with the oral history of it. Do you take these things with face value, knowing these are memories of not just the memories of a 9-year-old, but memories of a 9-year-old that have been fortified with 70 years of knowledge and experience, right? The people who mention in their things, but goes like, one of them says, well, it's 1944. Well, the war was going to be over soon. I'm like, did you know that in 1944 that the war was going to be over soon, right? So yeah, this analysis that they have made and analyzed, which I think differentiated this story, which was these are in Shushan's case, these are people who were children, but 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and mine were almost century.
Yeah. Just to add, so Sarkis and I had a lot of conversations before we started the interviews about where in their life trajectory do we want to catch these men, right? Do we want to capture their stories?
In other words, do we start with kindergarten or not?
No. In other words, there are men of different generations here available to us that we could interview about. And remember, in the beginning, this was about this conflict negotiation, right? So do we want to get men in their 50s, 60s, in their 30s, 40s? And we could.
It's a selection question.
Exactly. It was a selection question. And
which Gegham didn't have.
Right.
Yeah, we got whatever we got. Yeah.
And I think we did well in our selection to choose the generation that's in their late 30s, 40s, because they're young enough where this is still vital or instrumental for them. And they're old enough to be able to be reflective about it. So at first, so much of our questioning focused on how they handled conflicts in Armenia and how that subculture, functioned here. But then it really grew into a much larger thing. It grew into a coming of age story that starts from birth to wherever they are in their life. But very similarly to what Gegham was saying, there are certain memories that, of course, I related to, and I'm sure you will too now if I give you examples. So everyone's first impressions of LAX. Right? And what stood out? The lights. They're coming from darkness into massive lights. I think almost in every single case they mentioned, and we asked them, what was your first experience? Their first experience at a supermarket and the selection, the availability, not only of everything, but every kind of everything, right? And the lights in the supermarket. So there are these, elements of them viewing the world from a childlike perspective. Sarkis, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think the coming of age part is really important because even though we do interview them about their childhood, and that's like a big part of the background, the main sort of focus was on roughly what they're doing between 15 and 25, because that's when they're displaying their masculinity the most in this context where it's like conflict negotiation and becoming sort of adult men and becoming the one that people depend on and how those things start to play out. So the stories of childhood are really important. And we also saw something similar to the idea of like childlike observations and things like that, especially the stuff that was about Armenia. But something we talk about all the time is how useful it was for us to talk to people who had spent time reflecting on these things, and specifically maybe spent time sort of distancing themselves from this system, not completely maybe, but they've sort of matured and changed, and now they're looking back on a time that was recent enough that they remember everything, but distant enough that they can sort of give us a more critical view of what was going on. So that has its own problems, maybe in terms of bias, but I think we found that pretty useful for us.
You know, I've heard you talk about this program a while now. What conflicts were they resolving exactly?
You answer that.
It all starts in middle school, as early as middle school, and it's as simple as someone looking at an Armenian girl, someone looking at you wrong, someone insulting you on purpose or not. And then that goes all the way to adulthood, things like, it's hard to give nice and vague examples, but things like borrowing money, you know, doing favors, favors not returned, girls again, that just comes up at all ages. Yeah, all of that. Things that are deeply related to honor and pride, I think, are the central conflicts. So these are usually insult-based reactions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's take this one step further, because then I'm going to come back and ask Gegham about essentially the same thing. That is the formal institutional structures that they created for themselves. So before we talk about the 1940s and the formal institutional structures, so let's take this to the next natural step. Somebody looks at an Armenian girl wrong, not my girl, somebody's girl, a girl, or whatever else you said. And now there is a conflict. So now how do we, being men, even if we're 13, how do we resolve this? What happens next?
Should I take that?
Yeah, start and then I'll add.
Yeah, so the first thing you have to realize is that everything is based on a complex hierarchy. So at 13, you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, but you know, an 8-year-old is even lower, but even an 8-year-old can play into this system. So we'll say they're all about the same around 13. So a 13-year-old is insulted, and they can either try to resolve it one-on-one with another 13-year-old because they're sort of at the same level. Or if this is a 20-year-old insulting a 13-year-old, then that would be immediately escalated to an older brother, an older friend, a cousin, and then sort of the next level above that would be, you know, uncles, you know, even older cousins maybe, and then above that maybe fathers. That's sort of very severe. And then even above fathers, there would be the sort of people that the fathers would look up to. So there's a clear like patriarchal hierarchy of who's going to resolve this thing. And then in terms of mechanically, what's going to go on is at whatever level these people find themselves at the current time, because it can change. So let's say we have 2 cousins involved, no longer the main people insulted, but it has been escalated to cousins, right? These 2 cousins will get in touch with each other. They'll figure out who they know in common, whose side are they on, whose friends do they have. Basically, they're trying to determine what army they'll bring to a potential conflict, not even necessarily to fight, but just in terms of the idea of resourcefulness. Who do you know, basically? And that determines your status, that determines your you know, ability to, you know, protect other people if you're sort of asked to escalate something. And so a lot of the time what we heard was when conflicts reach this level where the two parties are talking about who they know, they'll find someone they have in common, and then they'll just resolve it immediately because they'll realize, you know, my friend is your friend's brother, and then that's it, it's over. And they'll just tell the lower level people to get it over with, you know. And if they don't, then that's sort of the mechanism we were more interested in. They will pick a time and place and go with their you know, small armies. This can be anywhere from one person to, we've heard up to like 50 people, I think, for the extreme cases. And the goal of this meeting is to resolve the conflict without violence, believe it or not. So you bring all these people, and then both sides get together. Maybe there's another sort of, oh, I know someone on that side, so we'll work it out. And maybe there's just a verbal sparring, which is a system that we studied a lot, where basically you have a kind of court case to determine who's wrong and who's right. So both parties will pick a speaker and they will kind of clash. And that's why we were really interested in the linguistics of this, because there are certain linguistic structures and codes and words and a kind of cleverness that will get you to win even when you're wrong. So that's the kind of system we're looking at.
I just want to add a couple of details. In that initial stage where Sarkis mentioned their calling to check who knows whom, it's very important to understand where you are in the hierarchy and where your potential opponent is in the hierarchy. So here you're doing your research to know who you shouldn't cross, because maybe you don't have enough status to cross that person, right? It might be in your favor to resolve this issue. But at the same time, this entire subculture revolves around this notion of honor and maintaining your status. So every incident is an opportunity to make you vulnerable to lose status or to enhance your status. They are all constantly aware of the fact that they are constantly being evaluated and assessed. So I think that's really important. Also, the time and place, particularly the place, indicates the severity of the conflict. So if you're meeting at a Starbucks parking lot versus at a cemetery, if you're meeting at the cemetery, this more likely involves violence versus if you're meeting at a park, that's like a medium level. And then the other important element is that everybody believes that there is a jish and schal, that there's a kind of a right and wrong. And everybody believes that there's an authority who can fairly dispense justice. I think this is really important, at least at this stage in their life. They all subscribe to the fact that this is going to be resolved and justice is going to be dispensed, and they will follow that judgment, right? If whoever the oldest person or the person with the most authority is, whoever makes the call on who's wrong and who's right, they take that. And they're okay with that. Even if you end up in the wrong, you don't want to end up in the wrong. But if justice is dispensed, it's dispensed, right? Yeah.
So we're going to continue with Gegham again, and again, it's a content question. And then after that, we're going to start talking about process. So Gegham, this whole idea of structures of authority, both internal and interactions with the larger authorities around them, how did they maneuver, navigate those processes in the middle of post-war Germany?
It is that because a lot of them, it's interesting that stories that where this culture and structure comes into Armenian reality and where my research is are kind of back to back. This non-formal reality of the criminal code running the society rises right after World War II, when during World War II, Soviets release a large number of former prisoners or the ones who are living in the gulags into the army, and then these people return back after the army into the society. rehabilitated, but it's hard to let go of the criminal ways. And so that's why a parallel structure forms in the Soviet Union, which eventually ends up bringing about this lifestyle and adherence to this culture. So a lot of the Armenians who lived in the Soviet Union, the ones that ended up in Germany, were disenfranchised from the beginning, because as I mentioned, they were refugees from the Ottoman Empire, and as marked as Turkish subjects, were not allowed to fully participate in the Soviet society, which forced them to rely on these informal structures even prior to the war. Prior to the war, the structures they relied on were these craftsmen groups, right? So there would be all the bakers. Bakers would have their own society of bakers of Kharkiv, right? They used to have their own bake shop. They used to work together. So would adhere to the collectivization in a way, but then they would be completely outside of the society. So they come to Germany with this framework kind of familiar to them. So when in Germany, they're on their own initially. So they start forming these connections on their own. Oh, you know, Sergei from Kharkiv, I know Serap from Kiev, and then this. And then when they eventually end up in the camp, partially it is because probably they are completely overlooked by everybody else, right? All these international organizations are dealing with Jews, Ukrainians, Poles, and Armenians are on their own in this army barracks. That might be a reason why when I visited the DP archives, which are kept in Maryland National Archives, there's almost no mention of Funker Kazerme, this Armenian camp in Stuttgart, as if they hadn't existed. But these people were on their own. They were getting minimal supplies from the UN and the International Refugee Organization. But other than that, they were their own. So almost the condition forced them to create these networks, right? So they had, it was like almost like an autonomous Vatican in the middle of Stuttgart, right? They had a president, the camp, a notable Armenian. And how some Armenians become more notorious in a group than others is based on either their previous record. There are the ones who were very prominent in the Armenian liberation movement in the Ottoman Empire. We have interviewed a person whose father was a prominent commander of the defense of Van. So because of that, he was naturally chosen as a leader of the camp. So there are a few others, a few of them like that, who were either prominent in Kharkiv or in the old country. So then they become these natural leaders. And there is the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Dashnatutun, whose members who have survived and made it to the camp take a leadership role in the organization. So it ends up being imagine a political party already in the camp. So they take upon themselves all of the running of the camp, right? Misak Torlakian, who wasn't a displaced person, he's one of the Armenian vigilantes who after the genocide were assassinating Ottoman leaders, who also ends up by chance living with these people in Germany because he's also a refugee. In his memoirs notes that ARF pretty much ran every aspect of the camp life. So, but because this is an organization that had at the time already 50, 60 years of experience of running Armenian community, right? Armenian state. There are also several very high-ranking officials of the First Armenian Republic who also end up at the camp, right? I think the first police chief of Yerevan is at the camp. Two of actual cabinet ministers of the First Republic are refugees at the camp, right? So these are leaders of the former life who naturally end up becoming leaders of the present life. And a priest happens to be among the refugees, priest from Russia, who naturally becomes the priest of the camp. Yeah, but at the same time, the Mughnetsyan Abbey, the Mughnetarist Abbey of Armenians, which is located in San Lazaro, Venice, and also in Vienna, Austria. The Mughnetsyan who are in Vienna, Austria, which is also under occupation, are able to freely move around the Austrian and German camps and come upon these Armenians and also end up helping them out, because a lot of Armenians especially from Erzurum, were Catholic, persecuted as Catholics during the Russian Empire, during the Ottoman Empire, right? Nobody wanted Catholics around. So, and then persecuted within Armenians, because Armenians are not Catholic predominantly, right? They're apostolic. So Catholics are looked upon as a schism and a faction. But then because the Mughnetsyan have their way around in Germany and are able to support, Catholics also get this support in the camp, at some points oversized support in comparison to the non-Catholics, because these are also largely Soviet Armenians, so religion is a tertiary matter for them. A lot of them are at this point non-practicing in either way, but all of a sudden have this awakening because it's available now. And
Say something quickly about the interaction with non-Armenian structures.
Well, that's where it becomes a little complicated in this story, because of perceived or otherwise, and some degrees of collaboration, right? What people's actions during wartime, in one way or another, could be perceived as collaboration with the Nazi regime. So due to degrees of it, some people already know German because they have lived in Germany for a while, or have contacts with people. So that puts them in a position to able to be, to create these networks after the war. But also because they are in this island in the middle of Germany, the contacts they have is first of all with the American administration, because Stuttgart is in the American zone of occupation. So they have contact with American military personnel who come into the camp, who visit them a lot. But also a similar thing already starts happening in Germany when these people who are very savvy in business start creating a black market, right? So this is post-war Germany. There is need for everything, from shoes to automobile tires. So everything is in need, and also everything is in ruin. So people are able to procure things from here and there. And these people very soon learn that out of the camp, they can go around cutting stuff. American soldiers are buying everything. Germans don't have any money and are willing to sell things, right? Antiques, gold, jewelry, belongings, clothing, just because they need any kind of food. So they would take the rations, take it out, exchange it for these valuables, and then sell it, and then make streams of income. So by the time in 1949, 1950, some of them have full-on shops and businesses in Stuttgart. Okay, camp life is no longer suited for them. So some already rent apartments outside of the camp and then start living there. Some of them almost don't even want to come to the United States because they're like, the life here is good already. But
Okay, my last question to all of you, and then questions
From our
very patient audience. So my question to all of you, both projects, is the question of proximity and distance, similarity and difference. So Gegham, you clearly were not of the same generation as your subjects. You are clearly not of the same trajectory. Did that make your job easier or harder?
I mentioned it on my last talk too. Fortunately, I'm very well versed in this time period, in the topic of the First World War II and afterwards. So, and I had the language skills. So I spoke the languages that displaced persons either considered their native language or was their language of communication. So even though I had not myself been through those experiences, unlike Shushan's case where that project is very recent and very known to us, even unlike the Understanding Independence project, which I have also personally experienced that time period, and I could speak to it. But because of those two factors of speaking the language of the people and knowing the subject, it made it easy.
For you, what about
For
from their
myself.
perspective?
Also for their perspective, because there was a degree of trust that I felt that they felt. That here was somebody listening to their story who would do justice to it. So that's why they spoke freely. And what the reason why I sighed is because our conversation wasn't very technical, just in front of the recording equipment. We would be sitting aside from the recording equipment at the lunch table or on the couch, and the conversation would be at the same level. So it wasn't people who were just giving their testimony and didn't want anything to do with you after. So in that sense, it was very much, it came to a point, I felt like, even though there were 50 years between us, I felt like I was speaking to my peers, we were understanding each other. So that was, I thought that was made it work.
Okay, Dr. K and Sarkis, and your peers, how did that go?
So again, I think we were very intentional and very aware of who we are as interviewers and researchers and what type of responses that generates. So I was of their generation, of their cohort, had many of the shared lived experiences, but I was a woman and I'm an academic. And we had lots of conversations about where these interviews should take place. Should we invite them to my house? Should we go to their house, right? Which is the case for the DPs. They would in their own homes, the cemetery or Starbucks parking lot. I mean, ideally, I wanted to send Sarkis into a conflict negotiation, right?
Yeah, we talked about it. Yeah.
But so we eventually, and I think smartly, ended up deciding that we should have them here on the campus in our studio, but after work hours, because one of the first comments we used to get is, "What, USC is interested in our story?" Right? I think the first kind of visceral reaction is, no one's been interested in my story, particularly this element of my story. So that was super important. Did it make it harder or easier? I don't know. Both. It sparked and triggered a lot of my own experiences and memories that I hadn't thought about because so much of it was shared. I remember so many times debriefing afterwards with Sarkis and saying, like, I can't believe I hadn't remembered that, or I hadn't thought of that, or I hadn't kind of observed that. And I was one of the girls who may have been looked at the wrong way, and the two boys may have fought over what happened to me. And I may have been completely unaware that this ended up in the park or the cemetery, right? So it was, and then all of a sudden, outside of the interview setting, I would be in social settings and watch these dynamics play out. And thank God I had Sarkis to message and say, you have no idea what I'm witnessing right now. Or he'd message me somewhere and say, I'm in such a moment right now that's very similar to what's happening. But I think our pairing was super, super important because, so I'll say one more thing and pass it on to Sarkis. Here I am, a woman of their generation, and very importantly of their, with a shared linguistic repertoire. That was very important. I spoke like them. I spoke, or I had command of the various registers they would use. And that created a sense of trust and intimacy, besides the fact that I was of their generation. But it was super important for me and for the dynamic that Sarkis was not. He was a young Armenian man ready to be socialized. So you can take it from there.
Yeah, I think I was sort of positioned as the bait the new recruit, a lot of the time we were saying because Dr. Karapetian's familiar with the kind of like, not even the systems actually for the conflict, but just the, you know, general cultural things and linguistic things, that I kind of serve as a, you know, independent person to be taught what's going on. So because I don't know anything, they want to tell me everything. And then that allows us as a pairing to be both completely trusted and get sort of perspective that would be towards someone who doesn't know anything. So that's kind of a hard balance to get without two people. And a lot of the time in terms of trust, they would not trust me without both of us there, and not even a little bit. And then other times we would end the interview and they would ask me things like, do you have a girlfriend? Like, I'm gonna, I want to teach you how to, you know, all these things. Because that trust had been built, but also because they're trying to sort of transmit the kind of masculinity that feels right to them.
Are there stories that would not have been told if the interviewer duo identities and tandem was not right?
Yes.
Absolutely. A big example of this is cursing. You know, some of them had to just look at me while they're cursing, because cursing in front of women is so is seen so badly, especially with this kind of hyper masculine structure. It's actually even worse than it would be if you were not participating in it. So a lot of them had to actually look me in the eyes and avoid eye contact with Dr. Karapetian because they couldn't, they didn't want to curse in front of her.
Not because they were cursing you out.
No.
They weren't cussing you out. Why was cursing a part of this conversation?
Yeah, cursing is everything as far as showing friendship, showing brotherhood, making people your enemy, testing people to see if they'll fight back. It's like the key socializing tool for young men to kind of fight and be friends. So it was really important for us to learn how it worked and the structure of it. So
we asked explicitly. So we would ask, can you share curse words and can you place them in the hierarchy? So in terms of kind of how grave they are, for example, after which curse word or combination are you at a point of no return where this is going to resort in physical violence, and so on and so on. But I think one thing I want to make clear is, because I had such a shared background with them, had Sarkis not been there, a lot of things would have been taken for granted. Because Sarkis was there and I would introduce him as someone, like as a blank slate, then that forced them not to take anything for granted. They really had to articulate things that otherwise would not have surfaced. I think that was super, super important. And in terms of how intentional we were for setting, so first of all, I was the one who made contact, right? And it was usually either through a personal connection or an intermediary. And so there was a, Shushan is our friend, our sister, our cousin, you can trust her, right? Okay, so you get that first initial pass, but then they come to the USC campus and now Sarkis has to earn their trust. So I'm the intermediary now saying Sarkis is my chosen person, you can trust him, all of that. But we would have like a little coffee set up here in this big room where we would sit and chit chat, where they would interrogate Sarkis. Who are you? How old are you? Do you have a girlfriend? What are your plans for life? How many children will you have? You should have X number of children, and so on and so on. And once that was accomplished, then we would walk into the studio. And I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't seen it, it's just a tiny studio with black walls, no windows, no clock, nothing. There's no time, there's no setting. Again, kind of a blank slate in that sense. And then we would be there for like 3 to 5 hours where these people would share their life stories. And there was such intimacy created that often we would skip taking bathroom breaks because none of us wanted to kind of distract from that. But then we would come out into the big room and it was very jarring to go from the intimacy that was created to now the lights of this room, all of that. And there was like an awkwardness where we would all run to the bathroom and then we would all come back. But again, then they would continue with kind of socializing Sarkis. It was really interesting. There was kind of transitions, pre-interview, interview, post-interview, and then later I would get messages that were directed to both of us. Usually it would say, "Thank you so much. That was very therapeutic. There are things I've never thought about or talked about that you guys kind of made me reflect." Often at the end of the interview, we would get to where they are now, what are their biggest hardships now, and how they see themselves as fathers and men in comparison to their fathers and the way they were socialized. And that's kind of where we would conclude, and they were left with that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Questions?
Thank you both. Really interesting projects and presentations. I have a couple of questions for Gegham. I apologize if I missed it. Are these full life histories? So incorporating their entire lives, and also where will these live? Will they be available to the public, and what are your future plans?
Yes, they are full life histories. It starts with where were you born and who were your parents, until the present day. I mean, for most of them, 2018. So, and the latest interview we did was in fall of 2021. So that was it was to the present day. Obviously, a lot of it, the time it took was the DP part, and the follow-up is also a lot ways influenced by that, right? It's their life in the United States, in Montebello, working and living with the people they were at the camp with, most of the times marrying somebody from the community, their children getting married to each other. So it becomes very familiar group, but then ends up to the present day. And we're presently in the process of making them available
Through digital.
through the digital USC digital libraries. Still, the process is being worked out how available they'll be. It'll be the show us model, where some of the interviews are available and the others are available to people who either will be here personally or there will be some kind of releases and everything. But eventual plan is to have them all available publicly or to researchers and whoever is interested in the topic.
Thank you. Crispin?
Another question for that again. Two quick historical questions. You kind of touched on this, but were all the 4,000 DPs in Stuttgart, were they all from parts of what was in the Soviet Union, or were there people from the kind of interwar diaspora that was in Western communities from Paris, Prague, Warsaw, and was there any Armenians from those communities in the DPs that also happened to come to? Well, I have a second question.
The interesting part is that majority of them are from what is Ukraine, Crimea, and the Russian North Caucasus, the areas that were directly under German occupation during the war. We interviewed one person whose in-laws were from Greece. So these were Armenians who had escaped to Athens, but also areas that were under German occupation. Armenians from France did not make it to the camps, but the other way happened. Armenians who were stuck in Germany, some of them were able to get to France. Some of them were saved by the French Armenian community through marrying somebody from the community, or just shielded by them, and then later on made it to the United States. Also, same way, some of them made it to Argentina and Brazil and Venezuela, and then came to the United States, just because those areas were open and accepting of refugees. But however, we also have one interview that I've done, a person who was a German, who married an Armenian displaced person and ended up living at the camp. Their wedding was at the camp. Yeah, they ended up living there. So one interviewee who's not Armenian, and also a few Armenians, one Armenian who was born in Germany because her parents were in Germany. Yeah, so, and also others that we didn't get to, but were German Armenians who had by chance ended up at the camp after the war, or were closely associated with the camp while it was there. So they have kind of been accepted into the community, but predominantly Soviet Armenians.
Sorry, quick questions about repatriation, but not repatriation to Soviet Armenia. The forcible repatriation that was under the Yalta Agreement of Soviet citizens back to Soviet territories after the war. I know other communities tried to hide out from that. There were forcible movements, but the Allies forced people in that direction, and mass suicides, and that's known from other communities. But was that a factor for this group of people too? Were they actually Soviet citizens, or did they not get citizenship?
So that's what I touched upon. A lot of them were not Soviet citizens. They were, as Turkish subjects, were never given Soviet citizenship. A predominant number of them were, especially the ones that I interviewed, were already born in the Soviet Union. So even their parents weren't Soviet citizens who were persecuted in the 30s. They already themselves were Soviet citizens. But a large number of were Soviet citizens, and a few of them talk about how during the repatriation, a group of Armenians left to go back to, because especially those who were not forced into Germany with their entire family. The ones that we have interviewed, fortunately, were displaced with their entire extended family, sometimes grandparents, uncles, aunts, entire groups. But there were a fair number of them who had elderly parents left in Kharkiv or in Kiev or Novorossiysk and Rostov. They went back. A lot of the people had later on, 20, 30 years later, had been able to connect with the people, and sometimes it was even family members. We interviewed one person who, by the time they were pushed to Germany, their sister, who had been forced to go to Germany earlier, had returned back to Kiev. And so the family thought she was dead. She thought the family were dead, and they were only able to connect in the 1970s. So 30 years after, and found this. But then, yeah, the repatriation touched Armenians too. A lot of them hid because of it. A fair number of them faked their documents and put their birthplace as Iran to escape, which we have the ledger of the Armenians who were at the camp, and there's a fair number of them whose birthplace is Salmast, Iran. Like they were, and then they confessed that when we were interviewing them that we didn't know what this place is, but we just put Iran anyways so that we wouldn't get deported. Yeah.
I'm interested in the idea of the transmission of trauma. I mean, it's pretty obvious, you know, when you're a son and you're talking to your dad and he's talking about something that happened in Turkey, you know, and he breaks down in tears, you know, that's pretty clear. How about, you know, transmission of trauma through children in the womb? I mean, they sense the bombings going on outside in Beirut or in Syria, and they grow up sometimes jury people, and you wonder why they always fly off the handle, you know. Is that all those valid connections? I mean, is there somebody?
That's beyond our sphere. However, well, there are no medics here, but it is something that keeps coming up. It comes up in the Jewish context, it comes up in the Armenian context, up to the point of talking about some of the autoimmune diseases that especially Jews and Armenians have, and tracing the roots back to the seeds of you know, inborn trauma. So it's a fascinating topic. It's out of our purview.
Trying to fit it in somewhere.
Yeah,
There were more than 100 children that were born while the parents were already in Germany or already born at the this person's camp in Stuttgart.
Right.
So we have interviewed I've interviewed one person who was born there, or two, I think two of them that were actually born at the displaced persons camp. But yeah, the fact that there were a lot of children at this camps was a reality. But
And was any study done on them, psychological study?
as I
No, but I want to recall something that Beth Meyerowitz, who's a professor of psychology here at USC, said, because we had a DEI panel, was it a year ago, I think, we've all lost track of time. She works with genocide survivors, not just Armenian, but Armenian as well, and looking at kind of intergenerational or transgenerational trauma. And something she said was that there's a general kind of mistrust of others, that there's this hypervigilance, hyper awareness that's coupled with like high levels of resilience. So the downside is this kind of mistrust. The upside is this ability to kind of get back on your feet. So
Well,
Did you interview any people who had experienced so much trauma that they were reluctant to talk about it? And if so, how did you handle it? Because, you know, a lot of people talk about not wanting to re-traumatize by making people talk about it. So
Yeah.
did you encounter that?
very much so. It was, I guess, with both ways. Yeah, it was both ways, in a ways that I was sometimes surprised how easily that they talked about trauma. But the reality was that what was happening wasn't new to, I guess, neither their parents who had been through genocide, and then, so I was mentioning, by the time they got to Germany, all of these people had been through at least four stages of displacement at that point. So they had been through so much of it that instead of it becoming too hard to talk about, it was almost as daily life for them. So it was becoming too hard for me to listen to, because to experience this constant trauma, and then see how imagine these people going through it. But to them, they had become almost not desensitized, but had grown as almost like a thick skin to this, had kind of had an antidote to this trauma, even if it was very traumatizing situation, on and on and on, right, year after year after year, which had made them very resilient to it in a sense. But yeah, we didn't have instances of people. Not maybe I mean, we heard very terrible stories. I don't know, maybe there were even more ones that they didn't get to or didn't want to share, but what we heard was they were very open about it, those who were willing to talk.
Shushan, did you ask anyone for interviews and got no's?
yes, oh yeah,
Really?
oh absolutely. Yeah, there were people who didn't want to share, but to answer your question from our project's perspective, I think for a lot of people, they weren't aware that some of the things they experienced were traumatic. And it was only through the telling and through the contextualizing for us that later they would reflect on, well, maybe this was abusive or maybe this was traumatic. So that was interesting as well, is, you know, out of this context, I remember I had a friend who was studying domestic violence, and she was very frustrated that Armenian women in Armenia, for example, won't take advantage of shelters or services, right? And you first have to see yourself as a victim to seek resources. So it was, that was interesting. I don't know, Sarkis, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I was thinking a big part of what they would do when they were reflecting was sort of contextualize it in opposition to how Americans would see it. So for them, a lot of the things that they would say would be, this sounds bad to you here, meaning me, or this would sound like non-PC or whatever. They'll use these kinds of words to say, this doesn't fit the cultural norms here. But then they'll describe something that probably would be universally traumatic, but is so maybe, yeah, I guess normalized in the situations that they were in, that that it's almost funny to them that other people might see it as trauma or abuse or whatever you want to say. So that has a lot to do with the kind of performance of masculinity that we were studying in particular. So we would hear like a lot of jokes, a lot of funny stories, and that was probably a way of coping with it as well.
And sorry, one quick sentence. I brought this up at the OHA panel as well. I think both in Gegham's case and in our study, you need a critical mass, right? There was a critical mass of people who had a shared experience for whom certain things are normalized, and the tellings of it and the performances of it are normalized. I think if there were just one or two individual cases in kind of a larger host society, it would be a very different sort of awareness and reflection process.
My question is for Shushan and Sarkis, very quick.
Louder, louder.
My question for Shushan and Sarkis, I recall a 20-year-old conversation with a relative of mine who lived in Glendale. He had Barska gangster friends and high Salsi gangster friends, etc.
There are no Barska here.
I don't know what to call it, the VTech crowd in the 90s. I wanted to ask about homophobia during the Razvirat or Jamo period. And I recall, it's a faint memory of a hierarchy of things that were tied to, oh, okay, but then he's gay, etc. Even though that's not the case, but it's masculinity, the patriarchal worldview. I want to ask, did homophobia, how often did it come up? And was there, you can keep it short because we don't have much time, but
Sarkis, I'm gonna let you take this one.
Yeah, every interview mentioned homophobia. Almost every story, maybe like at least 80% of the stories mentioned some kind of homophobic something. And the reason for that, just to keep it short, is that their concept of homophobia has to do with dominance. And so in the sense where being gay is letting another man dominate you. That's the kind of view. So it's not, so a lot of the times the idea of being gay was symbolic for being weak, not actually literally gay, and vice versa. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
Yeah.
that's what I recall.
Yeah. Anybody else? Sandra?
Thank you so much for this interesting presentations, and those projects sound amazing. I wanted to ask, I'm assuming that you have releases, you have the people that you interview sign releases. So what kind of thing did you ask them to agree to? I mean, because I'm not sure how you're distributing it. And then the other question is, it looks like a massive amount of data that you had to manage with all the appointments and all the information about all the people and all the metadata really. What kinds of tools do you use for these projects?
Is it for all of us or just?
Sure.
Yeah.
Our release was that they knew that this was going to become a part of a university archive, and they were consenting to it, and also would be used by researchers and for other research and academic related materials. So that they knew and they were signing. Also, we had a separate release because we were also taking photographs, all photographs if they had, to scan and add to the personal stories eventually when they would become part of the university collection. This would be photos. We necessarily asked for old photos because we wanted photos of from their time in Germany at the camp, if there were, because as we mentioned, this isn't a subject that is largely studied or covered, meaning the Armenian displaced persons. So we wanted those records to kind of add the visual to the stories. So some people were gladly giving them, and then we would scan or return. Others gave the physical copies and were okay with us having them. Others wouldn't, either didn't have any or just wouldn't want to give. But release was that they knew that this was going to be part of it, and then they were consenting to it.
Not the case with us. We did an IRB. And when we invited these people, it was under the conditions that only Sarkis and I would be privy to the information. Anything produced, research articles, monographs, whatever, would the anonymous would not reveal any kind of identifying information. Yeah.
So do you have your hand up? Otherwise, Crispin gets the last
I think
question.
Mane had a question.
Mane,
too,
did you?
Yeah.
Okay, Mane and then Crispin.
I was just going to ask, so this for you and Salkis, but over the course of your research, did you find that any of these like negotiation tactics were transmitted to also like the LA environment? And then what role did like Armenian language play in terms of like, for example, when men were talking to each other, when would they speak English versus when would they speak Armenian, like in situations of anger or conflict?
Well, that's exactly what we were studying, is how this system was kind of transmitted into the Los Angeles context. And what was so striking is that Armenian maintained its prestigious status. Something that I wanted to bring up before, and I'll come back, tie it into what you're saying, is, so in Armenia, everyone was Armenian. Every young boy was Armenian, right? And so the boundaries were different. The boundaries were the boys on my street, the boys in my Tah, Kucha neighborhood, whatever, versus the boys on the other street in the other neighborhood. And then now you bring that system here. And, so I think one of our participants brought this up, saying like there weren't enough of us from my street. So it was okay to go along with the guys from the other street or the other neighborhood. Now the boundaries are very different, right? It's the Armenians in Glendale versus the Mexicans, for example, or the Central Americans who are teasing them or attacking them or threatening them. So all of a sudden, the groupings are different, and all of a sudden your Armenian identity has now surfaced, right? The fact that you're Armenian now is on the surface, it matters, whereas in Armenia it didn't matter. And the language dynamics were super, super important, right? So during these conflict negotiations, most of these conflicts, by the way, are Armenian versus Armenian, right? English really diminishes your prestige if you use English, whereas if you use Russian, it increases your prestige. And many of them aren't quite fluent or don't have good command of Russian, but they know the key words, right? They have a general sense of the semantic range of a cuss word. And if sometimes, a couple of times we ask them, well, what does it specifically mean? And they're like, I don't know. I just know it's like beyond the point of no return or below the point of no return. So that was interesting too, right? Yeah.
Crispin, hang on, Arman.
Yes, thank you for interesting this presentation. And when I trying to understand this inter-Armenian conflict, I'm coming across the Israeli case. If you're familiar with this Israeli case, you know that the Sabra, this is the Jewish person who was born in Israel. And it doesn't matter where he will emigrate, it doesn't matter. He try or she try keep this Sabraness. So the question is, do you interested in this case? I mean, are you trying to find another analog to put the Armenian cases? Because we know that Israel has the large community, diaspora community here in Los Angeles, in New York. Maybe I'll give you a good idea to put these two cases together and see what kind of connection there are between people who was born in their state and in diaspora. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. I think one thing we realized, and Sarkis, I'll let you follow up if you have something to add, is that this is a universal coming of age story. Yes, it's specific to this cohort from Armenia transported to LA, but one, there are so many competing narratives just in LA, right? Of men coming from a home country to now LA as host society, and how those dynamics shift and how they influence each other. But really, this kind of evolved into a anthropological, linguistic anthropology project that's looking at how young boys are socialized into manhood. So I think any kind of parallel example would make it the richer, and our study will make theirs the richer.
Sarkis, real quick.
We saw parallels with like the Salvadorian community in LA. We saw parallels with the Russian community in LA. So, and then those are kind of more similar because they have the displaced part, but even with other minority groups that are living like in substandard conditions in these urban environments, we're seeing the same kind of vague structure of masculinity, of conflict negotiation, and of rejecting the, mainstream authority. So.
Yeah, so touching on upon what you just said, comparing the two communities, what about communities, Armenians here and Iranian Armenians here? Did you come across those?
We didn't,
differences?
no, but there's definitely an internal hierarchy from the perspective of our Armenia-born participants. In their worldview, in their mindset, there's a hierarchy of macho-ness with the different types of Armenians, and of course, they're at the top.
The word that comes to my mind is Warsaw.
Yeah, and Iranian Armenians are not so high up.
It's been fast.
Oh, just you mentioned about, well, Gegham mentioned didn't really have to select. You did have to select. How on earth did you select?
Yeah, Sarkis, you want to answer this?
I think you should answer this actually.
Okay, so there were a couple of requirements. They had to be Armenia born. They had to have experienced, they had to have been born within a time range to have experienced the dark years. They had to have come to LA. What were our other screeners? I'm trying to remember.
But beyond the mechanical, the fundamental was the connection and the trust. I mean,
Yeah.
you did not go down some judicial system. You didn't go to LA County Records and said, oh, here's some
No.
IANs I can call.
No. And the other thing is, again, we started with a much narrower sense of the type of person we wanted to interview. For example, we were interested in kind of the hyper version of this. So whether that was former incarceration, whether that was a gang membership and so on, only to realize that this subculture permeates so many more layers of society, that even if you're not kind of central to this, even if you're peripheral, you're still a carrier of these environments, of these notions, of these worldviews. So I think we were much more specific in the beginning and became much more lax later on. And then it kind of took on a snowball effect of, once we earned the trust of a couple of people, then they would say, even during the interview, like, you should interview my buddy because he initiated that big fight at Glendale High School that the news wrote about, right? And then we would call the buddy and the buddy would say, well, you should interview my brother or my cousin and so on. And it just kind of snowballed from there.
Alas.
So many questions.
I know. So everybody's not going away, so please join in. I want to thank the Shoah Institute, with whom we collabed on presenting these two panels today, both of which were presented at the Oral History Association annual conference here in LA just a few days ago. These conversations will be uploaded on the Institute's website. So if you thought these were absolutely brilliant and would like to share them with others, you will be able to do so. Thank you all for being here, and thank you three for fascinating information. Susanna, do you want to add something?
As I mentioned right before lunch, on November 14, right here, again, we'll have an all day open house where we'll showcase two of our oral history projects, the Understanding Independence, which interviews those involved with the independence movement from the Soviet Union, and the Displaced Persons Project, which Gegham talked about. November 14th.
Thank you all.